Okay, so in this video we're just going to go over the basal ganglia, like the pathway and like some clinical functions with it. It's really not as bad as the last videos we've been doing, like the pons, the midbrain, cerebellum. Those were a lot, they were very detailed. This guy, he really only has like 6 different structures we got to worry about. So I'm going to zoom in on each different layer and we'll take it from there. Okay, so the first part I'm just going to give like a little brief overview and like where things are located. And if we remember, we had a video with the tracks, right? And we had different layers of the brain, right? In the beginning we had the prefrontal cortex. Here we had the gyrus. We had the precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. And then behind we had the cerebellum, right? We also had the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia has 3 main functions. It's going to help us start movement, stop movement, right? And then modulate movement. What does this mean? Okay, so if I'm going to move my arm, the basal ganglia, right? Remember we said it was the blueprint? The blueprint for what? Well, I'm sorry. Someone sent a blueprint to him, and he was the inspector who was like, all right, good to go. We could start movement. He sent it to the postcentral gyrus. So all he's going to do is like, all right, I want to move my arms. People are going to send him signals. People as in different lobes of the brain. We're going to send him signals and he's going to move my arm, or he's going to relax my arm, he's going to stop movement, right? He's also going to help control unwanted movements like twitches or like shakes and stuff like that. He's going to help stop that. Now, what are the structures of him? So number 1, you see up here, right, on either side, this is called the caudate nucleus, okay? Number 2 is on either side. He's going to be known as the putamen. Now, number 1 and 2, so the caudate nucleus and the putamen combined, right? They're going to form the striatum. So they're going to be known as the striatum. Okay, not too bad. Number 3 is the globus pallidus, right? So the globus pallidus. What does he do? Well, he's right over here, number 3. I didn't write in 3, but number 3. And he has an external side, so external, and an internal portion. What his job mainly is that he's going to receive fibers from number 1 and number 2, known as the striatum, right? And he's going to send these fibers and he's going to redirect them to different functions and locations. We're going to get into that in more detail in a little bit. Now, number 4, I have the thalamus. Okay, where's the thalamus? So see this blue line right here? This blue guy is the cerebral aqueduct, right? Or where the cerebral spinal fluid is located. So in the central ventricle, basically. Not the cerebral aqueduct, I apologize. It's where the cerebral spinal fluid is located. Now number 4, on either side of it, is the thalamus. Remember the thalamus, right? When we, let me draw them right here. The thalamus, it had different layers. We drew them kind of like an X. Superior, inferior, medial, and lateral. Well, the main ones we're going to look for, or are we going to be focusing on, are going to be the lateral one and the anterior one. Another name for anterior is ventral. Okay, so we're only going to be focusing on the ventral anterior and the ventral lateral, so like that. Now, that's of the thalamus. Number 5 is going to be the subthalamus. So he's going to be right underneath, right? Here's the thalamus, here's the subthalamus. Not bad. Number 6, I didn't write in, but we spoke about him in other videos. He's mainly in the midbrain, correct? He's known as the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is divided into 2 parts. We're not going to go through it right now, but he's got 2 parts. And we're mainly going to look at the top part. The top part was the pars reticulus. And his main function was to release what? Dopamine. Okay, so we're going to look at the top part of the substantia nigra. And his job is to release dopamine. One quick thing I forgot to mention was that number 2 and number 3, when these guys combine, they form something else. What do they form? They form the lentiform nucleus. Okay. The lentiform nucleus. Now, real quick, 1 and 2. So the caudate nucleus and the putamen form the striatum. These fibers are going to end up traveling into the number 3, the globus pallidus, via what? Number 2 and 3 combined, and the lentiform nucleus. These fibers could travel different ways, which we're going to talk about next. Number 4 is the thalamus. Number 5 is the subthalamus. Number 6 was what? The substantia nigra. Now, all of these structures are in the basal ganglia. The three functions are to start, to stop, and to modulate. What does modulate mean? All right, so to control the starting and stopping, basically, right? It helps move. It helps with different functions. Helps regulation. That's what I should have said. Okay, so that's just the basic background anatomy. Let me do the pathways real quick. So now, real quick for the pathways, right? You see how I should have drawn a line going horizontally across, like that. But we have 4 different types, right? We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Really, we only have 3 pathways, except number 3 and number 4. I broke them up into 2 just for a better explanation. But each pathway is going to correlate to something. Remember I said the basal ganglia has 3 functions. It's to start. So for start, that's going to be the first one, the direct pathway. It's going to stop. Okay, stop is going to be for the indirect pathway. And then to modulate. Modulate are going to be for these 2 pathways. It's really just one pathway. However, it's much easier to break it up. Makes a lot more sense. Now, I'm going to zoom into each pathway individually instead of just giving you like this far away picture because it's like hard to see. Okay, so first, to start movement from the basal ganglia, right, is going to be the direct pathway. It's really not that bad. Okay, so if we remember, we get a lot of supply from where? The cortex. Okay, the cortex is going to start sending fibers down, and they're going to be called as a certain type of fiber. These are going to be called glutaminergic fibers. So like glutaminergic fibers. What does that mean? All it is that it releases, or they travel down and they release glutamate. We have to remember, what was glutamate used for? It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. If we released GABA, what is GABA? GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And these guys usually work hand in hand, so it's important to know that. Now, the cortex is going to send down glutaminergic fibers, right? And they're going to put these fibers into 2 different locations. What are the 2 locations? Well, here's number 1, here's number 2. Okay, these guys kind of look familiar from our basal ganglia anatomy diagram, right? And they were known as the caudate nucleus, so I'll just draw it in on the side for you. Caudate nucleus was number 1, and number 2 was the putamen. Now, real quick, what was the caudate nucleus and the putamen? When they were combined together, right? They're known as something. They were known as what? The striatum. Striatum. Now, so these fibers, right, go to both of these structures. So they're really traveling into the striatum is what people or questions would say. The striatum. They're not going to say, oh, the caudate nucleus or oh, the putamen. No, they're going to say the striatum. No, that means both of them. So now, I said they were glutaminergic, correct? So that means they release glutamate. So these fibers come down into each of these structures and they release glutamate. Glutamate was what? A positive, so an excitatory neurotransmitter. Now, when they release glutamate, these fibers are going to travel, or new fibers are going to travel from the putamen and the caudate nucleus and the putamen to where? We're going to travel into the globus pallidus internus. Now, if they're being stimulated by glutamate, right? That means they're sending positive action potentials. Positive action potentials. Now, so glutamate is right here. Glutamate sends positive action potentials because it's excitatory. Fine, that makes sense. Now, the globus pallidus, right? We have 2 sides, the externus and the internus. We talked about this. The side for the direct pathway, right? It's only targeting the internus. So it's only targeting the internus of the globus pallidus. Now, these fibers, right? They don't release glutamate. The new fibers are going to release GABA. Okay? We said GABA was what? Inhibitory. So it's going to release an inhibitory fiber. Okay. So if it releases GABA, what happens? We're not going to have a strong action potential traveling down. Now you're going to say, that is so stupid, Joe. Why? Wouldn't you want to stimulate this guy? 1 second. Now, the action potential, right? We're not going to have a strong one. Why is this important? Because this fiber, this guy right here, he also releases GABA. Okay, so if he releases GABA, right? That means we're not going to have a lot of what? inhibitory stimulus. Now, if we don't have an inhibitory stimulus when we reach, what is this area called? The thalamus, particularly the ventral, what? Anterior or ventrolateral, right? If we don't have a strong inhibitory stimulus, we could send another fiber up to the cortex. Now, when we send another fiber up to the cortex, it's going to release something, or it's going to stimulate something. He's going to stimulate a positive motor activity, so it's going to be a positive motor activity. Now, why is this important? Okay, because if we can stimulate all these different tracts, right, we can control, so we can have controlled movements that we want to do via the motor activity from the direct pathway. Now, we know how to stimulate, right? Direct pathway, so our wanted, wanted movement, right? We know how to start our wanted movement. So stuff that we want to do. Now, real quick, why is this so out of ordinary? So look, if we have more glutamate, right? So if more glutamate is released, where is more glutamate going to be released? Right here, into the striatum. So if more glutamate coming out of the striatum, right? That means we're going to have more what? We're going to release more GABA. Okay? If we release more GABA, what does that mean? So if we release more GABA, we're going to have less action potentials. So we're going to have less of a positive response. Now, if we have less action potentials, that means we're stimulating even less GABA. So if we have less GABA over here, we can have more action potentials being fired. Why? Because if we have this, right? This is our resting membrane potential. Now, if we have a lot of GABA, lots of GABA, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to hyperpolarize this, right? It's inhibitory. Now, if we don't have a lot of GABA, so we don't have a lot of negatives, you could say, we're going to excite it. We're going to go up. We're going to start our action potential. Fine. So the key takeaway for the direct pathway, more glutamate in the striatum means more GABA in the globus pallidus or globus pallidus internus, meaning less GABA in the thalamus, meaning more of an action potential, stimulating the cortex, meaning more motor activity. Good. Now, it's going to be a little bit different for the indirect pathway. So we're going to go through it real quick. I wanted you guys to understand that pathway pretty well. The only damage, or not only damage, a clinical correlate is if you have damage in this pathway, right? We could lead to Parkinson's. Why can we lead to Parkinson's? Because what are we doing? We're having hypokinetic movements now. How? If we have a damage here, right? We can't stimulate this whole pathway. This whole pathway won't be able to target the cortex again, which won't be able to activate our motor activity. So we're going to lead to Parkinson's, also known as hypokinetic movement. Fine. Okay, so now the stop one, right, is indirect pathway. Why did I say he was a little different? Just look at it. The last pathway, right, so the direct pathway, we had a cortex going to the first structure, known as the caudate nucleus, and then into the second structure, the putamen. This was known as the striatum, right? These fibers proceeded down into this region right here, the globulus I can't pronounce this word. Globus pallidus. Okay, so we have the same thing here. Fibers coming down into the striatum, known as the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Then we're traveling to the globulus pallidus. Now, for the direct pathway, right, all these fibers they went into the internus part, and then they went into the thalamus. Now, for the indirect pathway, a little different. We're not originally, the first part, we're not going into the internus part. The first pathway they're going to travel into is the external part of the globus pallidus. Now, after that, they're going to proceed into another structure. This green structure right here, we talked about it. This is called the subthalamus. Okay, the subthalamus. Remember, the direct pathway, we didn't go to the subthalamus. The indirect pathway, we're going to the subthalamus. Now, from the subthalamus, we're going to travel up into the internus of the what? Globus pallidus, the globus pallidus internus. I'm just going to start saying GP. Okay, GP from the GPI going to the thalamus. Now, what areas? The ventral and the lateral, right? Regions. They're going to travel up and they're going to go to the cortex. Now, I'm going to explain what they do right now. So I'm going to erase this little diagram I made. Now, just like the direct pathway, what's going to happen? The cortex is going to send these glutaminergic fibers, right? And they're going to release glutamate. Cool. This glutamate is then going to target what? It's going to target the GPE, globus pallidus externus. Fine. When it does this, right? This glutamate is going to send something down, right? No. Here's where it's different. The externus, it doesn't release glutamate. It releases something else. It releases GABA. Okay. I thought the globus pallidus released GABA and released glutamate. It does, but in the internus side. The externus side releases GABA. Oh boy, of course, right? So, if it releases GABA, it's not going to send a strong stimulus to where? Well, the GABA is inhibitory, right? It's not going to send action potentials into our subthalamic nuclei. Okay. If it doesn't release any GABA, right? It doesn't send GABA down, or it doesn't send an action potential, it's not going to release what? Well, GABA is also released from this fiber. So this fiber is stimulated. It releases GABA, and it releases GABA in here. Now, if it doesn't release GABA, right, we're going to have what? A less inhibitory effect. That means we have a more excitatory effect. Okay. If we have a more excitatory effect, what can happen? So we can send another fiber up now with a lot of action potentials, right? Positive ones. Now, these action potentials travel up and they go into the internus. Cool. If it goes into the globus pallidus internus, it releases glutamate. Whoa. I thought we said, let's look real quick on this side. I thought I said GABA, right, stimulates this pathway. Okay, and the GABA does what? GABA was inhibitory. So if we had an inhibitory tract, why would we want glutamate here? I'll show you right now. The glutamate, right, is positive. He's going to send what? More of a positive effect. So he's going to release even more glutamate. Good. If he releases even more glutamate, what does that mean? Well, that means GABA isn't being released. So that means what? There's no, or I'm sorry. This glutamate over here sends more of an action potential. More of an action potential stimulates what? More GABA. Oh boy. So if we have more GABA, what does that mean? That means we're going to have less of an action potential up here. If we have less of an action potential up into the cortex, we're going to have a decreased motor response. This is where everything flows. Okay, so in the direct tract, right? Real quick. Cortex, caudate nucleus, putamen. These guys form what? The striatum, we know that. The fibers travel into where? The internus. Sorry about my drawing. Goes into the thalamus. Correct? So, in the direct pathway, right? We had more what? We had more GABA. More GABA send what? More GABA didn't send any APs to stimulate this guy. So no GABA was released. If no GABA was released, we had an action potential, fire. That action potential did what? Stimulated motor movement. Okay. Here, we release glutamate. Here, we release GABA. If we release glutamate, we're going to have that positive tract. That positive tract is going to release more GABA. Here, GABA over here is not going to stimulate the thalamus, so it's not going to release any GABA. Here, in the indirect tract, we're releasing this GABA. If we're releasing this GABA, that means we're not sending the action potential. If we're not releasing the GABA, we are going to send the action potential. Because if there's no GABA, that means excitatory. So the cell or the thalamus stays positive. If we're releasing GABA, it's going to become negative. It's going to be hyperpolarized. So it won't be able to depolarize and send up the action potential. Now, what does this mean? So damage, right? If we damage this pathway, if we damage the stop pathway, we're going to lead to a couple of different diseases known as hyperkinetic movements. Why? Because we're not inhibiting our unwanted response. We're only stimulating it. Okay, so we're going to lead to Huntington's disease, Wilson's disease, chorea, which I spelled wrong, and then extrapyramidal syndrome, which is going to stimulate our dopamine receptors, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. Just remember, the main takeaway for the indirect pathway, GABA, right? The more glutamate, or the less GABA that comes to the subthalamus, means the more glutamate can leave the subthalamus. The more glutamate that can leave the subthalamus means more glutamate that can enter into the GPI, globus pallidus internus. More glutamate in the globus pallidus internus means more action potential. More action potentials mean what? More release of GABA. A stronger release of GABA means a less release of action potentials, so a more hyperpolarized resting potential. Hyperpolarized, meaning no action potential, thus saying a decreased motor response. Boom. So now, the last pathways, right? It's going to be the nigrostriatal pathway, and it's really one, but I broke it up into two different types. So now, the one that's going to target the direct pathway, it's going to look exactly like the direct pathway. So, remember the direct pathway, right above this, we had the cortex going into what? We had it going into these two things are known as the striatum, right? This was the putamen, and what was this structure called? The caudate nucleus. Now, the caudate nucleus and the putamen sent the fibers into the globus pallidus, right? Then they sent it into the thalamus. Now, what did they send? Well, they were targeted by glutamate, and they sent positive action potentials across. Okay, cool. So if they sent the positive action potentials across, they helped release more GABA. More GABA sent a less of an effect to the thalamus. The thalamus sent what? A strong action potential because there was no inhibitory effect. Now, all this pathway is going to add is the substantia nigra. Very easy. So, remember I said there's a D1 and D2 receptor? Well, the D1 receptor is for dopamine, right? They're both for dopamine. But the D1 is for a stimulatory, and D2 is going to be inhibitory. Inhib. So I'm going to write. Now, the substantia nigra, right? All he does, he sends dopamine onto this D1 receptor. Okay, so all dopamine does, it acts like glutamate, and it joins these fibers and sends a stronger response. So now, if we have a stronger response of both glutamate and dopamine, we're going to release even more GABA. So more GABA is now released. If more GABA is now released, we have a stronger inhibitory response. If we have a stronger inhibitory response, that means we have more or a stronger action potential, right? Because it's less inhibited. So less GABA, that means stronger depolarization, meaning more motor activity coming out of the cortex. So now if we have more motor activity coming out of the cortex, it's known as amplifying the movement. So all we're doing is amplifying it's the wanted movements, we know that. The indirect pathway is for unwanted movements, so we want to inhibit it. So we're going to amplify our wanted movements via the substantia nigra, releasing more dopamine into the striatum, the caudate nucleus and the putamen in particular, amplifying our response of the glutamate with dopamine, more GABA, less action potential, less GABA released, stronger action potential. Now, if we have a damage, right, in our direct pathway or our substantia nigra, we're going to lead to Parkinson's. Okay, so Parkinson's, as we said, is hypokinetic movement. We can't initiate movement, and we really can't keep movement going, right? And it's our wanted movement. That's all this pathway does. It's really not too bad. The indirect part of the nigrostriatal pathway, right? These are for what? Modulating. They're helping to modulate it. So now, it's just going to look like our indirect pathway. We're going to go from the cortex to the striatum, in particular, the caudate nucleus and the putamen. They're going to target the external and internal globulus pallidus, right? They're going to travel down into the subthalamus. Subthalamus is going to travel back up into the internal globulus pallidus. Then it's going to go into the thalamus. The thalamus is going to send it out to the cortex. We know this. So now, all the striate nucleus is going to do here, not the striate nucleus, the substantia nigra, I'm sorry. He's also releasing dopamine like last time, but they have D2 targets on this side. The other side, we have D1. So D1 for stimulatory, D2 inhibitory. These D2 receptors, right, they're going to also, well, they're not also, we know in the putamen and the caudate nucleus, right, glutamate sends positive action potentials for a positive response, right, to release more GABA. Now, all D2 receptors do, they send an inhibitory response, right, so they're releasing GABA. That means our response, right, we're going to release less what? We're going to release less GABA. Why would we want to do that? Now, so if we have an inhibitor, these D2 receptors, right, they're not going to send a strong response anymore. It's going to be a mediocre response, right? So if it's a mediocre response, that means we're going to have what? A less response of GABA. Now, the response coming down, right? If we have less GABA here, that means our action potential response is going to be stronger. If that's stronger, that means this area, right, is going to release what? Even more GABA. Okay, so if we release even more GABA, that means we're going to have a stronger, right? A stronger what? No, it's going to be a weaker. More GABA is going to be inhibitory, so we're going to have a weaker action potential response traveling up. Now, if we have a weaker action potential response traveling up, that means we're going to have what? Less glutamate being released. So less glutamate is going to be released here. If we have less glutamate being released, it's not as excitatory. That means what? We're going to have a weaker action potential response going to the thalamus. If we have a weaker action potential response, we're going to release what? We're going to release less GABA. So if we release less GABA, we're going to be able to stimulate a stronger action potential because it's less inhibitory. It's not as inhibitory. It's more excitatory. Now it could travel to the cortex, and we could increase our motor D2 receptors, right? They're not going to send a strong response anymore. It's going to be a mediocre response, right? So if it's a mediocre response, that means we're going to have what? A less response of GABA. Now, the response coming down, right? If we have less GABA here, that means our action potential response is going to be stronger. If that's stronger, that means this area, right, is going to release what? Even more GABA. Okay, so if we release even more GABA, that means we're going to have a stronger, right? A stronger what? No, it's going to be a weaker. More GABA is going to be inhibitory, so we're going to have a weaker action potential response traveling up. Now, if we have a weaker action potential response traveling up, that means we're going to have what? Less glutamate being released. So less glutamate is going to be released here. If we have less glutamate being released, it's not as excitatory. That means what? We're going to have a weaker action potential response going to the thalamus. If we have a weaker action potential response, we're going to release what? We're going to release less GABA. So if we release less GABA, we're going to be able to stimulate a stronger action potential because it's less inhibitory. It's not as inhibitory. It's more excitatory. Now it could travel to the cortex, and we could increase our motor activity. So this nigrostriatal pathway is going to help increase our motor activity of what? Of unwanted motor movements. It's the way to modulate it, though. Okay. Now, if we have a problem with this pathway, right, it could also lead to, or this pathway could help lead into Huntington's disease, Wilson's disease, fever, as in from Korea, and then there's certain drugs known as extrapyramidal syndrome from the D2 receptors, right? That's how this pathway is going to help increase our unwanted motor movements. Really not too good. Okay, so that's basically it, and I'll do some practice questions, but I hope this helped.